Hello? Hello? Sean, hello? We're going to start up again in a few minutes, but first, with the next panel. But first, I want to introduce someone. It's a privilege to introduce her, who has made a decisive difference for the center and is making a decisive difference on this campus, Dean Amber Miller. Now, she's actually a physicist who studies the first nanoseconds of the universe, something that surpasses any understanding I could possibly have. But she has a powerful vision of what Dornsife can and should become, and I'm proud to say the Center for the Political Future is part of that vision. She often speaks of something I referred to this morning, and in many different ways on this campus, she's making real the ideal of the Academy in the public square. She enlisted me to the Unruh Institute, and now the Center. Together we enlisted Mike Murphy, and in the truest sense, we're all here today in large measure because of her. Ladies and gentlemen, Dean Amber Miller.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Bob. Thank you all for joining us here today at USC Dornsife. This group was constructed to be a group that may not agree on much, but I think we can all agree that those panels this morning were terrific. Can we give the panelists a round of applause? I'd also like to thank Professor Shrum not only for organizing this conference, but for building this center from starting with the Unruh Institute, building this center, enlisting Mike to help us with this, and creating something that has been one of my favorite projects since coming here to USC. And I think it's one of my favorite projects because I think what we're doing here is truly important. And I care deeply about it, so I'm very happy to see everybody here participating. I'd also like to thank our panelists for their candor and for their insight. It's so much fun to sit here and listen to people saying things that I haven't heard on TV in the last several weeks. We're also grateful to our friend Hope Warschaw, and I don't see her sitting here. I did before. The Warschaw family's generosity has been key to building Dornsife's leadership in practical politics. And Hope continues to help us strengthen this effort, not only by doing things like sponsoring fellows and sponsoring the conference, but in so many other ways. So Hope, if I'm not seeing you, thank you. Otherwise, thank you anyway. For some reason, a lot of folks came out to vote in the midterms this year. And I liken to think of the pundits that I was seeing, like kids on Christmas Eve, consumed with the question of what was Santa going to bring down the chimney this year. And as our panelists have told us, in the big picture, I think we pretty much saw what we expected to see. The pollsters got it right this time. But when we look a little bit deeper, I think we do see a story that hasn't been told before in American politics. Minority candidates made history. More women were elected than ever before. We saw the first 2 Muslim women voted into Congress and the first openly gay governor elected in Colorado. To me, this looks like progress. But so much focus during the election cycle on these numbers and superlatives made the fundamental issues facing us today seem almost like an afterthought. And I think another thing we can probably agree on is that we are more divided today than ever before. The late political theorist Russell Kirk wrote, "What men really are seeking, or ought to seek, is not the right to govern, but the right to be governed well." Whether you identify on the right or the left, I think this is something else that we can agree on. Governing well is about figuring out how to approach complex issues in ways that serve not only your interest or the party's interest, but for the common good. And this is where I think our political leaders stand to benefit from the expertise found in research universities. Through our Academy in the Public Square initiative, we in USC Dornsife are making a very concerted effort to bring the expertise that lives behind the walls of the ivory tower out into the world in new ways. And the hope is that we can make our expertise relevant to the communities and to the world. This newly launched center is one of my favorite pieces of one of my favorite projects because the Center for the Political Future exemplifies this initiative. It combines scholarship with a commitment to restoring civil discourse in politics And USC scholars work alongside pundits, politicians, civic and nonprofit leaders, journalists, and others to address some of the most pressing problems facing all of us today. They discuss complex issues in an environment where it is the best ideas and not just the loudest voices that carry the day. And I feel very fortunate to have both Bob Shrum and Mike Murphy as the co-directors. Representing the left and the right respectively, these two have sparred for decades on the campaign trail. As you've no doubt noticed, neither one of them is shy about expressing their opinions, but they've always done so fully respecting each other's right to have the wrong opinion. At the Center for the Political Future, we encourage debate on policy based on facts with an eye to history and an understanding of the likely consequences. And that's where the scholars come in. They are trained first and foremost as problem solvers who know how to analyze, contextualize, and interpret information. USC Dornsife has polls based on sound social science methodology that is published, and they have done an outstanding job where others have failed. Thank you, Jill. We have political scientists, sociologists, and economists who are helping us separate facts from opinions and to understand what is driving many of the trends that we see today. And we have historians eager to remind us which civilization was brought down by a policy proposed by either side. And in our Center for the Political Future, Bob and Mike keep us honest and make sure that all of this is done with respect. Obviously, we're not going to fix the political divide overnight, but we can demonstrate how to get civil, productive dialogue started. And it's happening in this room today. So I'm going to stop speaking and let it continue to happen. Thank you again for being here.
So I'm going to bring up the next panel. You can all start coming up. And I'm going to introduce the moderator of the panel, Steve McMahon, who's a strategist, the co-founder of a really innovative enterprise called Purple Strategies. You can imagine where he got the name. And he served in senior roles in 3 presidential campaigns, produced ads for the DNC in support of Barack Obama in the 2008 presidential campaign, and he's a very, very close friend of mine for a very long time. Steve, thanks. Excuse me.
Thanks, Bob. Oh, you know what? Okay, we'll just move down. Okay, so.
Sorry to interrupt.
Well, it's no interruption at all. I'm going to introduce you, Jim.
Good, thank you.
So with me on the panel is a distinguished group that Bob has brought together, representing a wide range of experience and a diverse point of view from the left. First, on my left, and to your right, Jim Johnson. Jim is the chairman of Johnson Capital Partners and led the vice presidential search committees for both Senator Kerry and for President Obama. And he also was a former executive assistant to Walter Mondale during the Senate years, and then was a key player and the campaign manager for Vice President Mondale's campaign for president. Dan Schwerin is a fellow here at USC this semester. He's been teaching speechwriting. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. He's a former director of speechwriting for Secretary Clinton's 2016 presidential bid and is the co-founder of Evergreen Strategy Group. Neera Tanden, you probably recognize from seeing her on TV all the time. She flew out this morning. Is flying back tonight, which is a tribute to her devotion to Bob Shrum. She's the CEO of the Center for American Progress Action Fund, which is a nonpartisan policy institute and advocacy organization. Prior to that, she was a senior advisor to Secretary Sebelius during the time that they were crafting and passing Obamacare.
Thank you.
Those
Haven't
of you,
gotten claps
I could tell,
in a while,
I could tell
so
who
that's
the
good.
Republicans are, the ones that didn't clap, right? And she was the former policy director for Secretary Clinton's 2008 presidential campaign. And of course, Tad Devine, an old friend, the president of Devine Mulvey Longbaugh, a Democratic media consulting firm. He was a senior strategist and media consultant for Bernie Sanders' campaign, which kind of rocked the world and certainly rocked the Democratic Party a few years ago. And he's, as those of you who were here earlier, he's been involved in 20 or more successful Democratic gubernatorial and Senate races and nearly a dozen successful campaigns for prime minister or president around the world. So it's a pretty experienced group. And I'm just going to start, just so everybody knows where everyone's coming from. Does anybody here on this dais right now have a candidate for president on the Democratic side that they are supporting?
Absolutely not.
No.
That they would like to disclose? Okay, so there we go. Does anybody on the panel, so there have been some conversations recently about who might be in the field this next time. And just to do like a little focus group thing, by a show of hands, and one of the people speculated about is somebody that we just talked about in the introductions, and that's Secretary Clinton, who you know, on the merits, you could say, well, she did get more votes than President Trump. She looks at a field with 30 people and says, well, maybe it's my time again. Is there anybody on this stage who, if Secretary Clinton came to her and said, do you think I should run? Is there anybody here who would say, yes, you absolutely should run?
She's not going to, so
Yeah.
Okay.
it's sort of it's a moot point.
Okay.
Despite the New York Times.
Despite the New York Times, despite the book tour, she's not going to.
I mean, the book tour, people should buy the book. I think it's pretty good, but she has no interest in running and is not going to.
Okay, there you go. So you've heard it here first. Everything that you're going to read for the next few
Actually,
months.
you've heard it multiple times. It just keeps going in the media. It's like multiple people have denied it multiple
Well, but I
times.
mean, Philippe was speculating about a week ago. Philippe, her former or current very close advisor, right? I mean, it's fair to ask the question because Philippe himself has speculated, others have. So you guys are saying not going to happen.
Not going to happen.
Okay. Tad,
Yes.
if
Steve.
Bernie Sanders came to you, and said, "Hey, you know what, Tad, I want to do this again. Some people say I'm too old, but I don't think I am. Some people say I'm too nice, I'm not crotchety enough." But, no, I'm kidding. He wouldn't say that. But if he said, "Hey, Tad, what should I do? Should I do this again?" What would you say?
I would say, Bernie, after what you did in 2016, I think you've earned the right to run for president again. I think your ideas have animated a large portion of Democratic Party politics, national politics, and frankly, politics around the world. And if you feel in your heart it's the right thing to do, you should run for president. You know, I think you've earned that chance, and you should seriously think about doing it. And I wish you well.
I wish you well. Well, so I just have to ask now.
I should have left that out, I guess.
What does that mean, Tad?
That
wish
means,
you well.
listen, I'm very proud of what he did, and I'm proud of my association with him in the campaign. I think a lot of the ideas that he talked about, you know, whether it was income inequality or free college tuition at public colleges and universities or health care for all, Medicare for all, and a lot of other things, climate change, are really big, powerful ideas that he put. You know, when he sponsored Medicare for all, before he ran for president, he was the only guy whose name was on that piece of legislation. Now I think there's 16 other United States senators that support it. You know, that's real progress. So I think, you know, if that's something he wants to do, I don't think he's too old. Okay, let me just say that for the record. I mean, this guy has more energy. I'm 63. He's going to be 78, 79. He's got a lot more energy than I do, okay? I mean, he can go day and night. So if he feels that he wants to do it, you know, I think it'll be an important contribution, you know. But we'll have to wait and see. I don't know what he's going to do. I have not spoken to him about it.
Okay, Jim. So you've been around this track for a while. You've studied macroeconomic theory, and you've seen how it plays out sometimes in politics, sometimes to the Democrats' benefit, sometimes not. Were you surprised? I mean, Democrats had a pretty good night last week. Were you surprised with a 3.9% unemployment rate that Republicans didn't do better than they did?
Yes.
So well, that was helpful.
I can string it out if you want me to.
No. Well, let me ask you one more then. I was at a panel recently where an academic scholar from NYU said, if you do a regression analysis and you look at the unemployment rate, normally you'd think a president with that kind of an unemployment rate going into a midterm would be at 62% favorable. Mm-hmm. With the tax cut, with an economy roaring, with Wall Street doing well, and with an economic, or with the unemployment at 3.9, how would you account for the fact that Republicans didn't do better?
They've got a very troubled storyline because there's a guy at the head of the story named Trump. It's very hard to get a pure economic message when you're working on everything else every day in a confused and not so impressive a way.
Yeah,
Let me just give you one quick comment. by way of background for people in the room who I've not had a chance to meet, I've actually worked full-time for 9 Democratic presidents. McCarthy, McGovern, Muskie, Mondale, Dukakis, Gore, Kerry, and 2 who won. Carter and Obama. And so you're right, I've seen some of this stuff. But my judgment is that economics is sometimes more important than other times. Personality and intensity is always important.
Right.
Qualifications to do what people expect would be an outstanding job, it's critically important. You know, so there are lots of different dimensions, and until we get going, I ran Iowa 3 times in the Iowa caucuses. I was there the first time we had political preference at the precinct level, running President Muskie's campaign.
He was a great president.
Yeah, it's only a few minutes long. I'll give you one more. Can I tell stories?
Sure. That's what we're here for, right?
Okay. So I had 2 deputies in Iowa running Muskie's campaign. Kent Conrad, the senator from North Dakota, and Greg Craig. One did the east, one did the west. We came in and we beat McGovern 38-23 in the caucuses on that cold 21st of January night in '72. Next day on the front page of the New York Times, the headline from Johnny Apple, R.W. Apple, the famous reporter, was McGovern possible nominee. We beat him by 15 points. Okay, so we're getting into the Iowa thing. I did it 2 more times. I did Carter and Mondale against Kennedy in '80, and in '84, Tad was there. I said to everybody, we will not lose Iowa or come close in Iowa no matter what. You will all go out to Davenport and Des Moines and Council Bluffs and all these places that you've never heard of and don't want to hear of on a moment's notice, because we are not going to lose. We're not going to get anywhere close to losing. And so we lined up and we won the Iowa caucuses 48-17. Front page of the New York Times the next day, Hart possible nominee.
And not much has changed.
Well,
And so as you go through this early stages, the expectations game, the momentum, the sequencing, the who loses most first, these are all huge factors. John Glenn, who was the hottest candidate against Mondale in '83, basically didn't make it to the Iowa caucuses. He lost in '83 before he got to his first contest. So that, you know, there's a lot of ups and downs, a lot of trickery, a lot of changing expectations. But I think if you say what role will a good economy play for the people who have some credibility in claiming the good economy, I think you always have to bet substantial.
right. Okay, so that brings us to kind of, if James Carville once said it's the economy, stupid, right? In a general election. In 2018, it didn't really seem to be the economy, which is pretty strong. In 2020, in a presidential year, will it be the economy, or will it be, as Jim points out, the top of the ticket and the distractions that we can expect from President Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think what was interesting about 2018 is how the actual economic conditions inverted in the election. So if you actually think about the people who have done well in this economy so far over the last several years, but obviously in the last couple of years, it is college-educated people and college-educated white voters in the suburbs and in urban centers. And what I think is really interesting about 2018 is that those voters, some of whom were moderately for Hillary, swung dramatically against Trump. So white college-educated women who just 10 years ago, 15 years ago, were the base of the Republican Party moved dramatically against Donald Trump and moved dramatically for Democrats. The fact that I'm sure it's been mentioned multiple times already today that Orange County has moved from near universal Republican control, at least in the congressional delegation, is now entirely likely to be Democratic, is a significant move, and that's really a function of a combination of immigrants, people of color, but really a surge of white college-educated voters. And 2016, white college-educated women swung towards Hillary. White college-educated men were slightly more in favor of Trump. Without, in this new cycle, after 2 years of dealing with Trump, both of those sets of voters actually moved more Democratic than where they were in 2016. White college-educated women substantially. And I can just say to everyone in this room, college-educated women, white women, African-American women, many Latinas are the resistance in this country. They are the people who, during healthcare, flooded town halls, and during the tax debate, even called members of Congress, and over the last several months have been staffing and volunteering in really some of the most competitive races, obviously in Orange County, but Abigail Spanberger, who won, who's Mickey Sherrill, Alyssa Slacken. These are phenomenal new women leaders. They are in Congress today because they had women basically staffing their campaigns, hundreds, eventually thousands of women staffing their campaigns on Election Day. And so I think what's fascinating about this is that these views of Trump are actually not related to the economy. White non-college men have actually, if you look at the conditions that they're in, are not dramatically different today than they were 2 years ago, but to them, the economy has dramatically shifted. So I think we have to recognize politics is infusing economic views more than economic views are infusing politics.
I think that's all true, but I would add that Democrats did focus on pocketbook issues relentlessly, especially health care. And Kellyanne Conway, after 16 at the Harvard conference, said something like, it's not what offends you, it's what affects you. And while I think that is not a terribly accurate view of how Trump ran in 16, I think it is interesting to look at this race and say Democrats were out there talking about health care and jobs, and Trump was talking about a caravan that was 1,000 miles away, and voters went with the Democrats. So in some ways, the conventional wisdom, the sort of Carville old conventional wisdom that is the economy stupid, like it was a Democratic campaign run with laser-like focus on pocketbook issues did succeed this time.
So Tad, there's no question that women surged for Democrats, that young people did, that people of color did, but the white male, which has been the core of President Trump's support, didn't come along in the same proportion. Some of those white males voted twice for President Obama and once for Bernie Sanders, and then in the general election apparently didn't come back out for Hillary Clinton. What does the Democratic Party need to do to bring those people along, or should we just kind of move on without them?
Well, I don't think we should move on without them. First, I think, the white males now fall into two categories, those who go to college and those who don't, okay? And that dividing line of education is becoming profound in our American politics today. I think what we need to do, and I think Sherrod Brown, I mentioned this last time in the other group, is a great example. He won white voters with college education by a few points, and he lost non-college whites by not as much, okay? 20 points, but not as much as others were doing elsewhere. And I think what we need to do as a party is we need to speak to people, who need help. And we need to convince them that the programs that we offer in terms of wages, jobs, health care in particular, and other core breadbasket economic issues they will benefit from. That tax cuts shouldn't go to wealthy individuals, 83% of them, and wealthy corporations. They should go to the middle class. That education for a child shouldn't mean that that child takes on a mortgage that they have to pay off the rest of their life. I think if we connect with them on core economic issues and convince them that we will fight for them on these issues, I think they'll give us a hearing.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think Sherrod is very instructive, but I also think we should look at the statewide races in Michigan and Wisconsin, and those were candidates. Gretchen Whitmer, for example, is a good example of a candidate who, really did move that state. She won by, I believe, 8 points in Michigan, and that is if you really think about it, since it was almost 80% presidential level in Michigan, that is a lot of movement from people there's definitely a group of people who voted for Donald Trump and then voted for Gretchen Whitmer. So I think Tad is absolutely right that we should look and learn from Sherrod's example, but we should also look and learn from the examples of Gretchen Whitmer and even Tony Evers.
Jim.
Yes, sir.
So here we are. We've just come off a pretty successful election. 37, 38, maybe as many as 40 House seats. We had 10 Democrats running in states that Trump won, and we did, I think, better than expected in the Senate. And yet here we are, Democrats nationally, I'm not talking about on this stage, and some of the old kind of divisions seem to be popping up again between whether we win by rallying our base and overwhelming the opposition, or whether we need to have a more moderate candidate like Bill Clinton was, and like many thought Barack Obama was. I actually believed he was, but obviously some Republicans disagree. But so does this seem familiar to you, this progressives versus moderates or establishment? And what advice would you give to those who are stoking these flames and fires?
Boy, that's a tough one. I gave all this information earlier, but I was on all sides of that issue.
I know you were.
In different campaigns. And when I started with Gene McCarthy, Johnson was still in the White House, right? And that looked like a sure thing for the future. When I was doing Muskie, McGovern came out of mostly nowhere with a progressive agenda and won. Carter came without much of an agenda beyond his biography. It was a biography and honesty post-Watergate spin, very important. And as I could take you all the way through the sequence, but at this point, if you said, who's the most likely nominee, I'd say Joe Biden. And they'd say, I'll bet you $100 on the field over Joe Biden. And I'd say, no way. I want the field. You take Biden. Right. And so I think at this stage, it is a very, very difficult proposition. I mean, some things are always with us. Integrity, past success, articulation, intensity. I mean, some of these things are part of all primaries at all times. But at this stage, I don't know whether the moderate tone, which has more of an economic agenda like Tad was just laying out, which I agree with, can start now and make it to the nomination and the election, or whether it comes later in the process. And maybe others on the panel would have a different view to that, but moderation has not always been the key to getting nominated. From time to time it has been, and Bill obviously did a good job. Carter did it essentially without ideology. So a lot of different ways of moving here, but it can happen at any time that you find some kind of way of getting things sorted out. And sometimes you get it, and sometimes you don't.
I think one thing, and I'll just say this briefly, I think we're not thinking enough about what actually happened in 2018, and I've said this for 2 years, which is every campaign, and 2020 will be very different from 2018, and 2018 was different from 2016. And I think what was really important, and I give Senator Sanders a lot of credit for this, is there was, in these races across the country, very liberal and very moderate people basically worked together to recognizing the kind of existential threat that we were facing if there was no accountability in the House. They worked together to elect people who were actually, kind of the best candidates, I would say, for where they were. We, in the Democratic Party, there are very good, very progressive candidates winning in cities, which really truly reflect those constituents. And in swing states and swing locations, swing districts, is more moderate members. And I think actually the party was sort of sorting out, because I think the central question really is for a lot of Democratic activists, and I would even argue for more, not activists, but a lot of Democrats, even more than ideology in 20, which was the case in 2016, is the issue of who can beat Trump. It's not as highfalutin, it's not as sexy, it doesn't speak to us, but it is a central concern, because I'd say for a lot of liberals out in the world, and this is moderates to hard left voters, I would like to get up in the morning and not worry what the crazy cray-cray came out of the Twitter feed, right? People would just like to have some sense of normalcy returned. But I would say, just to think about this, I think what was incredible, I had in my private time spent a fair amount of time helping better our work. And if 2 years ago someone had told me at this point, when I was really, really depressed, that Texas would be in a race within 2.5 points, and Georgia would have been a race within 2 points, I would have said that's crazy. And those were people, they were both people, Stacey Abrams and Beto O'Rourke were people who energized a new electorate in really fundamental ways. And I think we have to think through the whole issue, which is how to, just to be tactical about it, how to win the Midwest and also put southwestern states in play. And that's a whole round of tickets, and that doesn't need to be one person or another, but I do think that it's not going to be one formula. They're all going to have ways of inspiring people or making a very targeted message about how to do it, but electability was a critical issue for in almost every race. Andrew Gillum made an electability argument in his primary. He was arguing that we tried something, it failed multiple times, and he convinced a lot of people based on electability. And I think that's going to be a critical concern going into 2020.
Yeah, I agree with that. I remember, in 1992, Frank Greer was doing Clinton's campaign. And he and Margolis and, the people who worked together, they made a really great ad for Clinton, introducing him. It was biographical, it was what he did as governor, his agenda. And at the end of it, Clinton was in a meeting in New Hampshire, and he said, and it's about how we win again. Okay, that was the end of the ad, okay? And if you make ads for a living, that's the punchline, okay? That's what you're waiting to deliver. And, and that's what Democrats in 1992, after losing in 80, 84, and 88, were looking for. They were looking for someone who knew how to win again. Okay, and I want to tell you the desperation levels, I think, among my fellow Democrats right now with the current
Really
high. We really want to win again.
Yeah.
And now, how do we judge how to best win again? I would submit that the best way for us to judge that is to allow the fine people of Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina to have their say in this thing.
Did you forget California?
Absolutely.
Well, that's going to affect what happens in California, because California is now at the front of the line. And let me tell you something, what goes down in Iowa and New Hampshire is going to have a lot of effect on what happens here.
So, but you guys just mentioned who can beat Donald Trump, and that's obviously a big consideration. But there's also, and this debate's been around the Democratic Party for as long as I've been a Democrat, which is sadly longer than I'd like to admit. But it's the progressives versus the more moderates. And Bill Clinton wasn't in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but Democrats who had lost with Dukakis and Mondale the two previous cycles were ready for somebody who could win, which meant, I think, Bill Clinton. What happens this cycle? And who if you're picking lanes, you've obviously got the more progressive, the Bernie Sanders kind of wing, if you will, of the party. And then you have the slightly less progressive, but still fairly progressive wing that will include people like Mike Bloomberg and maybe Howard Schultz.
You're counting Mike Bloomberg as in the more progressive wing?
No, he's
the less progressive.
less
I'd say he's pretty
less
full
progressive.
moderate.
No, he's definitely moderate. There may be Bob Casey said yesterday he hasn't ruled anything out. Sure. You got a whole bunch of people from both sides of the party thinking about it, and it gets back to this notion of, is it a base election or is it a persuasion election, right? Yeah. So how does that play out? What if you think about who's the strongest candidate in the progressive? Who are the strongest candidates in the progressive lanes? Who would you say they are?
I think that two things. One, I think we are going to have this lane conversation for the next year, which will be, I think it will.
I mean, how do you accommodate 57 lanes?
Yeah,
that's the issue.
Exactly. But I think two things. One, Bill Clinton likes to say that politics is about addition, not subtraction. And I think the question will be not who wins each lane, but who can put together multiple lanes at once. Mm-hmm. Because you can't, and we've seen this before, you can't just be the candidate of a one segment of the party or another. If you want to win a nomination, you're going to have to grow that. And I think the person who is able to do that best will win the nomination. The other thing I would say is that I think that ideology as a way of understanding the splits in the party and that will be important is probably overrated. I would say it's there, but the policy differences are, we will find them and we'll debate them, but they're not that large. I think in the hierarchy of how to think about these things, like ideology maybe is here and identity is here, but then above that even will be sort of other characteristics, for lack of a better word, authenticity, like the candidates that sort of electrify or audiences, and Beto is a great example of this, the candidates who can sort of go viral. Mm-hmm. It won't matter. That quality is independent of, it's not driven by their ideological commitments or really even by their identity positions, although those things do sort of matter as signifiers. It will really be these sort of, what kind of campaigner are they? Do they capture the zeitgeist and sort of get their finger on the pulse in the right way and use social media well? And I think that it will surprise us because we'll come in looking for this ideological frame. Like, where does Beto fall on that
Well, we're
scale?
gonna
We
get
don't
to-
know. It doesn't matter, really, right? And it won't.
Yeah.
It,
I mean,
that
he
won't be
didn't
the
adopt,
determining thing.
and you know, he took some liberal, I mean, they were definitely liberal for Texas, so I'm not saying that he didn't support single payer in the end and things like that. But he was, I think it was the kind of race. And just to say something about Senator Sanders' race, I do think, just to build on what Dan said, I do think the nominee is going to have to demonstrate the ability to generate the kind of interest and enthusiasm that Senator Sanders did in 2016, which is I think a big indicator was whether you can raise money online, not where you're not being able to do high-end fundraisers. I think whether people actually defend you online, like people really formed a protective core around Better at Work, and they did for Senator Sanders. And I think those are, I think a lot of different candidates can do that. It's not just one model. But I think that that's going to be a lot more important than previous signifiers in previous presidential cycles.
Yeah, I think this question of who can succeed is going to depend a lot on the course of events. So, for example, in 1984, when Jim was the chairman of the campaign, I was a mid-level staffer for Walter Mondale. And, you know, we decisively won Iowa because Jim was determined that we were going to decisively win Iowa. You know, 8 days later, we went to New Hampshire. Yeah. Now, in New Hampshire in 1984, Ronald Reagan was unopposed. Okay? So that meant that all the independents in New Hampshire didn't really have to vote in the Republican primary because there was nothing going on then. You know what they did? They all went into the Democratic primary, and Gary Hart had a message that connected with them, had a great campaign manager. Her name was Jean Shaheen. Okay, she knew something about New Hampshire and how to run campaigns there, and they blitzed through the thing. Now, is Trump going to be challenged in the Republican process? Or, you know, is someone going to run is Kasich going to run outside the party? I mean, we don't know these things. If Trump is challenged and it's a legitimate challenge, the composition of the New Hampshire primary electorate is going to be very different. You know, I think what we do know, and one of the things I think I'm proudest of with Bernie, is that the New Hampshire primary electorate can get a lot bigger than anybody ever thought it could, okay? I mean, and when Mike Murphy worked for John McCain in 2000, and John McCain got 110,000 votes in the New Hampshire primary, no one ever thought that would be surpassed. That would always be the record. Mondale won with 75,000. Kerry won with 75,000. Dukakis won with 41,000 with a much bigger field. Bernie Sanders got 150,000 votes in the Democratic primary in New Hampshire with a contested Republican primary on the other side. Okay? So, you know, what you've got to do is figure out Iowa, New Hampshire, and then how you go to Nevada, and then that's South Carolina is a whole different piece. If you can figure out how, you know, in a multi-candidate field, you can make your way through it. You can be a moderate and win with 27% in Iowa. You can be a moderate and succeed, you know, with maybe 31% in New Hampshire. You know, you can find a way to do this in a crowded field, but you're going to have to be somebody who can then build a broader coalition. And that's not as hard to do as it sounds. If you get someone really progressive to stand up with you the next day and say, I'm with him or her, okay? You can do it really fast.
Okay, so we've been talking a little bit about this continuum, this left-right, or this, I should say, middle to the center-left to farther left in the Democratic field. There's also another continuum, which is this, you know, this new versus old, establishment versus change. And Jim, you've got some experience with this going back to the Mondale campaign, because as I recall, there weren't that many policy differences between Gary Hart and Walter Mondale, but there were a lot of stylistic, age, change, new leadership. That was the rhetoric of that moment. Mondale obviously was successful eventually in the primary, but how do you think that plays into 2020 as we go into this thing? Neera mentioned Beto, who certainly could be the change candidate this time, and the young candidate, the new generation candidate. How do you think, as you look at the field, who would be the candidate that you would most like to work for right now if it weren't Joe Biden?
Well, let me just take part of what you said and give you a little bit more background. The biggest thing we had going against Gary Hart was that he didn't know where he stood, and other people didn't know where he stood. And so we went from New Hampshire, where he did unbelievably well, into Super Tuesday, and he beat us in 7 out of 8 states. It was an unbelievable crash of a night for Mondale. We then went to Illinois, where there's something called the Chicago Machine, who saved us. We then went to New York, where we had old Mondale friends, some of whom were named Cuomo, who saved us, and we were back on top. And so this meeting expectations, exceeding expectations, not being a loser, not losing over and over again, is absolutely critical. I won't say the name of the person who I saw recently, but he or she was considering getting into the race and wanted to create a committee in Iowa. And I said, go to Iowa, be useful in Iowa, but don't be in Iowa, because if you go into Iowa and you don't win, you lose.
Right.
And if you go into Iowa and you lose, you're going to be dramatically less attractive as a running mate. So a lot of this has to do with the running mate dynamic as well. And so I wouldn't choose a single person at the moment. And I don't know, I would, if you, back to the Biden story, if you said one-on-one, do you want Biden or the other person? I think probably in every case, I'd take Biden. And I'm not particularly, I like Joe, and I like Steve Ricchetti, who runs his business, but I don't, it's not a priority for my next 2 years. And, but I think, I don't see anybody else at this point who you could say, and the others on the panel maybe have somebody to name. But I don't see anybody who I'd say, I want to go for this person to be the winner over Biden.
Okay, well, let me ask it a different way then, and I'll ask it of each of the three of you. If you were Joe Biden's campaign manager, who among the field would you be most concerned about as an opponent?
I would be concerned about two kinds of candidates. One is someone who could do better than me, Joe Biden, in winning voters of color. I think that Biden has a great claim to, I'm not saying he can't. I mean, he's Barack Obama's vice president. He has a long record of achievement. But I would be worried about that because the last several cycles have shown us that if you can't win, especially black voters, Democrats in the South, you are not going to be the nominee. It's how Hillary beat
Not going to be the nominee or not going to be elected?
The nominee. It's how Hillary beat Bernie. It's how Obama beat Hillary. And if you can't do that, I mean, the crowded field could fracture that math a little bit, but if you can't do that, it's going to be hard. So I would be thinking about that. And then I would be thinking about who's young and who could be grabbing excitement in a way if I can't. And I would be worried about someone like Beto coming in from that I didn't even take into account and electrifying people and making me look old and out of touch and yesterday. And I think that generational dynamic will be powerful for people. So I would be worried about both of those fronts.
Nara, what would you say if you were Biden's campaign manager? What would you fear most in the field?
I think the most important thing, I guess this is my own personal take about where the Democratic Party has to go, and that is if you actually look around the world at the rise of nationalist populist parties and where they succeed and where they fail, they outperform when they are the alternative to the status quo. And I think it is a deeply challenging issue for the Democratic Party to represent the status quo against Donald Trump. We should recognize he is deeply problematic in many ways. There's no way I really think he's good, but let me just say that he is a disruptor and continues to, there is a continuing strength he has in disrupting the political process. And I think it is really critical that the Democratic nominee represent change and represent a change in argument, a change in policy. And I think this was a deep challenge for Hillary in 2016 and a real worry. So my advice to Vice President Biden, is to think through how he can articulate and really go above and beyond in articulating an alternative to Donald Trump across the board. I think if the Democratic Party is arguing to return to status quo, an Obama status quo or any kind of status quo versus Trump, that is a deep problem. We have not had an election, except for 2012, 2006, 2010. 2012 is an exception. 2014, 2016, and 2018 were all change elections. Basically, independents won against the party in power. The most important thing for Democrats is that they captured independence in 2018 significantly. Texas is a good example, but really across the country, independents swung to them because we continually look for change. And I think that is a central concern for whoever the nominee is, but obviously people with more experience, I think, have to emphasize that more.
Yeah, I would say to Vice President Biden the same thing I said to Bernie Sanders about his opponents in 2016, Hillary Clinton and Martin O'Malley at the time, that we cannot worry about anything they say or do. We can only worry about and think about what we say and do. And that's all. And we should put the blinders on, and we should completely focus on what we're going to say in Iowa, how it's going to work in New Hampshire, how we're going to have the resources to build campaigns in those early states. And also, I think one of the big resource questions in 2020 is going to be, how do we get on TV in California before Iowa? Okay, now that is a big deal, okay? That is a huge deal, and that's going to cost a lot of money. And figuring out how you're going to finance that is going to be one of the keys to winning the nomination.
Okay, so I'm glad you brought that up because I have two questions. One, the first is, it's only happened twice, which Bob reminded me of recently, that somebody won both Iowa and New Hampshire and then just quickly ran the table. It's never happened that you had the kind of diversity in the field that you're going to have. And there are candidates who are already sort of saying, maybe I'll start in South Carolina, maybe I'll start somewhere else. So the first question is, can you skip Iowa and or New Hampshire and just start somewhere else? And then what we're going to come back to is, how does California change the calculus for everybody? And specifically, who does it benefit? Does it just benefit the hometown candidates? Does it benefit the best known brands? That's the second question. The first is, do you think it's a viable strategy in 2020 to skip either Iowa or New Hampshire? Jim?
No.
President Giuliani would tell us.
I guess I'll just, because I know Ted agrees with the consensus on this. I think we are thinking too much about how past is prologue. I really think that, all the conventional wisdom will be that you have to win Iowa, but it really depends on how many people are competing in Iowa. If a ton of people decide not to compete in Iowa, just remember 1992, Bill Clinton,
Tom Harkin.
Tom Harkin was
How
the
quickly
senator.
we forget.
The senator, he was competing in Iowa. No one competed in Iowa because he was competing. It's obviously a special case. But basically, all that mattered was New Hampshire because no one paid attention to Iowa because no one competed in Iowa. So I really think Giuliani was a special issue because he was one person not to compete. But when if we really have 17 or 18 candidates and 7 of them choose to go to New Hampshire first or go to South Carolina, or someone just decides to camp out in California. We're all talking about how these races take off. This is going to be the longest primary. I find it hard to imagine we will know until very late in the process, unless someone just cleans the clocks of everybody, who the nominee is. All these states are really going to matter in a race that has that many people, assuming that a fair number of them are still viable. And you have a lot of candidates who have a national following who are considering running. So I think we should not presume our past experience is what will happen, because that has changed every cycle in some significant way.
I don't want to be overly argumentative, but
you will.
But I will,
right?
if necessary.
Yeah, it's great. And I obviously defer
in
to...
this first story I told, the people who won in Iowa lost. And that was all it took to get to the next step in a huge way. So it's not just simply winning, it's beating expectations.
Yeah.
Dad?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Nira, did you?
No, but I'm just saying, look, in the kind of field we have, just to say it, you can beat expectations in New Hampshire, and then someone else can beat expectations in Nevada and South Carolina, and those could be entirely different candidates. So one thing we don't recognize as much, because we look at the Republican Party for this in 2016, there is a much greater, at least, diversity of experiences that will be on display. We are likely to have a Latino candidate. We are likely to have 1, 2, or 3 African American candidates. We are going to have people who've come from outside the political process. I just think, I think we should be more open to the possibility that our past experiences will not dictate what happens this cycle.
Yeah, well, first, I think the winnowing is going to occur before Iowa in 2020. You know, the money pressure is just going to be such, and some people are going to be able to raise a lot, and they're going to be able to set the table for everybody else in there, and others are just simply not going to be in the game, okay? And that's going to weed some people out. And then I think, you know, I mean, Iowa's a little tricky. People have, you know, McCain in 2000, you know, skipped it and was able to do very well. I mean, but I think unless there's an Iowa candidate running, I think you skip it at your own peril. I think you go in there and you try to demonstrate that you are winnowed in to a top tier of candidates. You know, that's what we did with Dukakis. And, you know, you know, Gebhardt, Simon, and Dukakis all got in the 20s. We were from out of town in Massachusetts. You know, Mike gave a speech that night the Olympics were on. He said, tonight we won the bronze, next week we're going for the gold, okay, in New Hampshire, and that's what we did. And, you know, and we beat expectations, and we raised money, and, you know, we had raised $10 million the year before, and that was a staggering sum. You know, you know, in 2016, on the night of the New Hampshire primary, Bernie Sanders, I was inspired by a line Bob Strum had written for John Kerry in the convention speech where he said, tonight I will, you know, say something that Franklin Roosevelt could have never said when he received the nomination of this party. Go to johnkerry.com, and they did. And you know, well, with Bernie, we had the online stuff prepared, and Bernie Sanders said, you know, tomorrow my opponent will go to New York and hold a fundraiser at a hedge fund. I'm going to hold a fundraiser right here, right now. Go to berniesanders.com. And we raised $5 million, okay, in a matter of minutes. So if somebody can figure out how to navigate that and how to do that and has that moment to communicate through the media that way and is able to turn it into resource advantage, then I think, you know, that's the person that's going to win.
The other thing we haven't really talked about is, with this crowded field, with a president who commands a microphone as big as Trump, and with so much the pace of news the way it is, and with Democrats taking back the House and everything else that's going on, it is going to be impossible for these candidates to break through and dominate the conversation in a way that in previous elections maybe they could. If you have a couple of celebrity candidates with national followings and everything else going on, just if you're not well known and you don't have amazing social media skills, it's going to be really hard. And so, you know, winning Iowa is like a traditional way of like catapulting yourself into the conversation. If you can't, I don't know how you win Iowa without breaking into the conversation already. So I think low profile candidates are in big trouble already. But like if you are a great organizer or a great social media person or a great online fundraiser, you have a prayer. But this thing is going to be really, really loud and complicated. And I think that sort of old paths of like working your way up are going to be a lot harder. It's just, it's going to be impossible to be heard over the din.
Yeah, I guess I would disagree with that a little bit in the following way, which is that I really don't think we know who is going to be able to move on social media or take off. And I mean, I talk about this candidate way too much, but I started talking about O'Rourke in, you know, I guess June of 2017 when, like, you know, he'd go to these places and he'd go to really conservative parts of the state and like 200 or 300 people would show up. And he was doing this Facebook stuff, but like no one thought he had a chance, right? But and his name recognition was like, I mean, he's a member of Congress from El Paso, like nil. And it took him a long time. It didn't happen overnight, but he built that social media process. And I will say, like, I talked to plenty of people the summer of 2017, and no one thought he could do that. People who knew him was like, he's just like a regular guy. So I think that Democrats are really hungry to engage in this process around the presidential, to talk to people. I think they're hungry all over the country. I think how people perform in Iowa, people's little, like when they Facebook their talks in backyards, it's going to go around the country. People in LA, I guarantee, will be watching some candidate, and in this coming summer, talk to people, because there is a desperation that I haven't seen in the Democratic Party. It was, I mean, way more than in 2004, because again, I mean, a lot of progressives, like hard, you know, very liberal to hard left, are a little bit like, this national nightmare needs to end. Right. And I think people want to move to that conversation really quickly. And I just think, like, we don't have any idea of how a Sherrod Brown would do versus a Kamala Harris versus a Cory Booker in an environment where they have never been before, and they are all making kind of compelling arguments from a certain vantage point about the future of the country.
So we talked a little bit about tactics and about states and about, you know, positioning and lanes and everything. And Dan, when you just went through that litany of, there are ways to distinguish yourself, and you've got to be really good at this or this or this or this. There's one thing that you left out, and I was waiting for you to say it, and I'm going to just bring it up now, and that is the course you're teaching here at USC is about writing speeches. One of the things that Barack Obama did so well to distinguish himself from the field, I thought, in 2008, was he was such a gifted orator. Do you think there's a place for that and for differentiating yourself simply in that space, or is that not sufficient anymore?
Well, I do, and I think Beto is a good example of this, actually. I've never seen him give a set-piece speech with a teleprompter, but the moment that catapulted him to national attention was this viral video of him answering a question very eloquently about the kneeling NFL players. And people looked at that and said, here is a candidate who is talking from the heart, intelligently and compassionately about an issue I care about in a way that is inclusive of different points of view, but is coming from a strong place of strong values. And it was packaged up in a nice way, and it went viral. And the ability to create those moments, I think, is going to be really important. And so it's less like, I'm working against interest here, but I think it's less can you give a really compelling 30-minute address on your health care plan, although I hope that candidates do that because I think it sort of sets an important predicate for governing. But in terms of your ability to make an impact politically, I think it's more going to be, can you create those moments of rhetoric, and it may not, but often it won't be even you talking. I mean, it could be you skateboarding across the fast food restaurant parking lot that will go viral and that will capture something important about you. But that ability to communicate effectively is always going to be really important in politics. I think the medium might change. But
Can I say something briefly about this that just ties to both Senator Sanders and Beto, which is I think people are deeply, and I think this is a universal concern, and people are deeply frustrated by politics as usual. And the thing that they are mostly frustrated is by people who say things that they think that people say things for the audience in front of them. So Beto O'Rourke never read a speech because his whole theory was people want to know what I authentically believe. And I think one of the powers of Senator Sanders in the 2016 race was he was saying things that like no political consultant, except for maybe Ted Devine, would tell you to say, right? He was very clear, right? He was very clear about taking on people and taking on interests. And I think the power of that is to infuse and I think people across the political system could do this. I think Donald Trump, one of his powers, I mean, I think he lies all the time, but a group of people think he's candid because nobody would tell you to say those things, right? No political advisor would tell you to tweet that way. So people think he's actually saying what he thinks. I mean, it's crazy, but he is saying what he thinks. And I really think this is, we talk a lot about ideology. I think the way people run their campaigns and how they communicate is going to matter as much as any other issue because I really think there is universal concern that the political process is broken. It does not work. It does not. It's like people are just basically, they're like an ingredient menu or something. And I think there are a bunch of candidates who can like really do communicate their values without ever reading a speech.
Yeah. Go ahead, Joe. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I was just going to make a side point that
I think political rhetoric is going to matter a lot in 2020. Not necessarily set-piece teleprompter political rhetoric, but political rhetoric that inspires people because Democrats really desperately want to be inspired because they are sick of being depressed every day watching him in the White House. And somebody who shows up as the antidote to that, and says, listen, I see the future clearly, and I know how to get us to this better place in the future. Because the future is going to be the key to success, in terms of a message, I think. And, if you get to that place and someone sees and articulates that future, some of it is substantive, a lot of it is just going to be about how this country works again for people, And that person, with the way they present themselves and the way they speak of these ideas, inspires others. People are going to gravitate towards them, and they're going to see them as the way to get rid of Trump, I believe.
I was going to make a somewhat different point, and that is that I've spent most of my adult life in business, not in politics. And in all the businesses I've worked with, lots and lots of boards of directors, Fannie Mae, et cetera, as important as figuring out how to win is figuring out how your competition can lose. And it's a very, very important part of a large field. That's what I was saying to this person who was talking about should Iowa be opened up formally. And without going into the details, in '83, Glenn was so unbelievably hot, and we figured out
The right stuff.
That's right.
the right stuff. But without any dirty tricks, we figured out 8 places for him to lose in '83. Maine caucuses, Iowa JJ dinner, et cetera, et cetera. And so winning is winning. But if people who are supposed to win lose,
Right.
that's also a big deal, which I'm sure you go through all the time in the advisory work that you do.
Yep.
Certainly a big deal in business.
Yeah, I agree.
So Neera mentioned something about people think the system's broken and they're tired of the status quo. Do Democrats help themselves by offering up the same candidates, or is it time for a Beto or somebody like a Beto coming from, not from nowhere, but in the same way that Senator Obama did in 2008? What do y'all think? Is this a Gary Hart year, or is this a Walter Mondale year?
Well, this goes into more detail than I'm prepared to manage on Beto. I had one dinner with him. I listened to him. I still teach down at the University of Texas occasionally. I have a lot of Texas political friends, most of whom Tad knows. And they were less impressed with the race that he made in the end than the people on the panel here. And they think that it was very, very winnable. And he didn't come up to it in the end. But I don't know him well enough to have an independent view, and I didn't go to any of those events, and I didn't see him performing. But I think it's not an unalloyed advantage to be Beto.
So leaving aside Beto, I mean, the Ocasio-Cortez lesson in New York, Beto in Texas, is the Democratic Party benefited or hurt by serving up the same candidates from the same generation, or would the party be better off in 2020 with somebody who's under 50, hypothetically?
Well, listen, if that candidate under 50 has the political skills of Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, yes, they would be. They'd be tremendously benefited by having someone step into the frame and to articulate a vision for the nation's future. Is somebody going to do that? I don't know. We're certainly going to have options, though. I think a lot of candidates are going to come forward, some of them new for the first time, and they're going to present themselves on the stage, and I think that there may be a real opening for them. But that doesn't mean that somebody like a Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden, or Elizabeth Warren or whoever isn't going to have an opportunity to make that case as well. And I don't think, saying, oh, they've been around too long, I don't think that's going to hold any of them back if they show up with the right message. And if they can figure out how to put together the resources that are going to be needed to win. I mean, one of the reasons I think we succeeded as much as we did with Bernie Sanders is that we raised a lot of money. Okay, Hillary Clinton went on television in beginning of August in 2015 with serious buys in Iowa and New Hampshire. 2 really good 60-second ads. And I remember going in with Bernie, showing him on my laptop the 2 ads, and with Jeff Weaver and I, the 3 of us, he said, what do you think you should do? Now, at that point in time, we had not taken a single poll. Okay, we had enough resources to get the thing going, but we weren't sitting on tens of millions of dollars. And I said, listen, I don't think we can play their game. I don't think we can do this. And I didn't want to make ads till we did polling anyways. Finally we started doing some in September, in October rather. And in the end, we had enough resources to compete. I thought it was incredible when Iowa and New Hampshire were over, I asked the media buyers to give me the buys for the 2 states. And it was incredible that the Clinton campaign, which started in August, and the Sanders campaign, which started in November, that was our first ad, 3 months for us, 6 months for them, spent almost to the dime the same amount of money in Iowa and New Hampshire, $10 million each in both of those states. And so unless somebody is going to bring those kind of resources to the table, they're not going to be able to compete. I don't care how charismatic they are or how great what they're saying is. I don't believe it. I think you've got to be able to compete on the ground, in the air, and with message to win.
Yeah, but I mean, just your example is Bernie Sanders raised the money he did because he had a charismatic message for people. It wasn't that he was basically going into backyards and his message was going viral, and that's how it happened. It wasn't like he put up ads to get all the money. He got money and then put up the ads.
Yeah.
So I think I think the question is that a possibility in the future? And I think there are really two things. People want inspiration, but they also want to win. And there are candidates who can who've been in the political process, who can make a compelling argument about how they can win. And there are other candidates who are going to be new to the process who might inspire people. And I think that they're all going to have an argument that basically intersects both of those things.
Right.
So Governor Brown, I think, set March 3rd as the date that the California primary would be held if the DNC approves that move. What does that mean in terms of Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina and Nevada, A, and B, if you're Kamala Harris or if you're Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden, what's the downside to just going to California and saying, I'm gonna get started here because I can raise the money, I have the brand or the name ID, and all these 150 candidates aren't going to be able to touch me?
Well, I think the downside of skipping those early events is you've created a gigantic opponent out of whole cloth who can then take you on the big stage.
Talk about an opportunity to lose.
Yeah,
you can be knocked out in one state.
Yeah, and
do it.
secondly, the price tag on that is going to be.
No, the price tag, but if you're Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders or a homegrown candidate, so forget about what is California? It's $5 million a week for television here, which means if you're not going to be prospecting for that kind of money or running a campaign of any length, if you have some momentum coming out of Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina and Nevada, then you're probably in pretty good shape. But if you don't, is California going to end it for a lot of candidates, or will it end before that?
No, listen, I think in a system of proportional representation, the Democratic Party, California is not going to be the end of the process, but it's going to be a decisive moment. And I think the best way to do well here is to do well beforehand and have the resources to compete here.
Yeah, the proportional thing is actually really important because there is this sense of, you win.
Does everybody here understand the proportional rules in the Democratic Party?
In other words, it's not winner take all. If we split up
all the way to the end,
all the way to the end, and we split up each state, delegates are apportioned based on the percentage of the vote you win, and so they could be split many ways in this coming cycle. And so in the media narrative, we put a huge amount of stock on who won the state, but in the delegate counting, it is very different. And Hillary Clinton won California and a lot of big states in 2008 and picked up you'll remember better than I will how many we picked up, but it was not nearly enough to make a huge difference. Whereas Obama winning smaller states by larger margins turned out to be sort of better math for him.
Yeah, he won caucus states more, with a much bigger gap.
So anyway, you could come into California, and even if Kamala Harris is able to win a plurality of the votes in a crowded field, it doesn't end, and lots of other candidates will walk away with good delegates and good halls, and will be able to live to fight another day. And so I don't think I think it'll be an important moment, but I don't think it'll be decisive in knocking people out in the same way.
Can I say one more thing? Since we're getting obscure right now, I'd like to really get obscure, which is that the changes in the Democratic Party rules in respect to superdelegates are going to have as profound an impact on the outcome as the adoption of proportional representation, which, by the way, I was very much involved in 1988 for Governor Dukakis. That was the deal that we made with Jesse Jackson. We gave up.
That was a 15% threshold, right?
Yeah, well, the threshold is something different. You've got to get 15% in order to get delegates. Right. But the old system of winner take all, by congressional district, loophole primaries we used to call them in places like California, gave way to proportional representation then. But now, with the superdelegates essentially not having the vote anymore on a first ballot, it is now a very, very different game. And you cannot go and coalesce as we did. Jim, really figured this out with Mondale. We were in there winning superdelegates, at the House caucus in January of, the year, and that lead that we accumulated and that Hillary accumulated as well was decisive in terms of the outcome. That's not going to happen this time.
I mean, we could actually talk about superdelegates till the end of time because it's really become like biblical interpretation. But I don't think we would ever have a candidate who didn't win by delegates elected by the primaries. And we have not had one. Hillary, obviously, we can all debate these things. But whether the psychological impact, but the actual impact on raw votes, if there was an impact on votes anywhere, it was in 2008. It was not, obviously, in 2016.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, but I do think the press is going to cover it completely differently when you have a system where someone's not 800 delegates ahead before it begins. Okay, it's going to be a whole different way that they cover the race.
Well, it's not just going to be covered differently. It's going to actually substantively be different
Yeah.
because no one's going to start out with 800 delegates. But Nero, you mentioned earlier that this will be the longest primary season ever. So it is still theoretically possible that the superdelegates, I mean, they don't
Yeah,
get
they
to,
could come in and
they don't
end
count.
the
So
convention.
imagine
Very
you have
unlikely, but
5 or 6 or 8. It hasn't ever happened, but that doesn't mean it won't ever happen,
Why
right?
is it the longest primary season ever?
Well, if
because
Nero's,
people will just go till, a lot of people may end up going till the end, or a few people will end up going
Isn't
till
it
the
pretty plausible to see a convention where no one has a majority and there'll be an incentive to go to, I mean, they'll go,
Use that
it
to
seems-
predict it.
The only reason that speculation, which we go through every 4 years, is actually realistic, I
Yeah.
think this time, is that people now have figured out how to raise money without going to rich people asking for money, okay?
Right.
Because the money dries up when you lose, but if you're raising it online, it doesn't dry up until people stop giving it to you. You know,
Right.
so that can keep people going. It's one of the, I mean, Bernie stayed into the end. We raised money to the end. That's one of the reasons we wasn't going to get out, because we never ran out of money.
and you had this, and you had this dispute, which I remember the superdelegate disputes going all the way back to Mondale in 2000, in 1984, right?
We thought it was a good idea to have friends of Mondale voting on the nomination.
So you set up the labor committees, right?
Delegate committees.
I'm sorry, delegate
Yeah.
committees.
Yes, we did.
But that was a controversy going all the way back as far as Gary Hart and Walter Mondale, which it has resurfaced periodically. How many people here think that it's likely that superdelegates will be decisive in this?
I don't. I think the voters are going to decide this, and I think they may decide it early. So.
Does anybody here believe if you win Iowa and New Hampshire that it's over
No.
this time?
No.
Not me.
Nobody?
No.
I think it's possible that somebody could come along and win Iowa, have a decisive victory in New Hampshire, and build up real momentum and not be stopped. I think that's a real possibility. And I think that's the best way to the nomination.
Do you believe that age will be a significant conversation point and or a significant factor in this? And will anybody make that case overtly? Or will it be, or will it be?
Yes, they have to. I mean, if you're the mayor of Los Angeles, or you're
example.
Beto O'Rourke, or any number of other younger candidates with smaller national followings and less experience, you'd be crazy not to make this argument. You'd be crazy not to make a new generation of leadership argument, because how else are you going to, you don't have more experience than Joe Biden. You don't have a better, bigger national organization. You don't have real policy differences. You got to make that argument. So I think they will.
Yeah, well, I mean, even Vice President Biden has said it's a legitimate issue, right? So it will be debated. We wanted to make sure we left time for Q&A, so if any, Mr. Murphy.
Good news is, I just want to pitch an alternate reality.
Okay.
I don't know if it's true, but I bet money. I think institutions that are disrupted, thank you. Institutions that are disrupted are often the last to know they've been disrupted. And I think there is a strong case that 16 changed the rules. Now, we all know what the old rules are. They were the same in both parties. You go through the funnel of Iowa and New Hampshire, which are different, and the top 2 or 3 come out, and the media then gives much more free coverage, which is worth a lot, and you compound. You raise more money, you get more votes. You find out that the free media that you get by winning is more important down the line than your paid advertising. Right. And that is how you kind of buck the bronco and go. Then you make an idiot mistake, and you try to recover from it, and on it goes. But it really puts the traditional media in the driver's seat, because they're the amplifier you desperately need. Nobody cares how many delegates you get in Iowa, New Hampshire, or even South Carolina, really. And we're winner take all, because we're vicious Darwinists. You guys are proportional. You go on for years. Everybody gets a prize. But Beto, and I was a Beto snarker, but Beto proved that if you put a really good streaming television show together, you don't need a lot of the traditional media. If you have really good content, which is easy to do in the planning meeting, very hard to do in real life. But if you have a great message and you have really authentic content, you can put on 40 million of these for free every day. And you have 40 million primary voters on the Democratic side who are rabid for information. Why do you want to give up on your favorite TV show in 10 days after the New Hampshire primary? Why don't you keep watching forever and getting that bump because, ooh, you're on CNN more now because you won New Hampshire. Maybe that's not worth so much anymore.
Yeah.
So I think we might have the 4 or 5 TV show primary.
I think I was closest to the Mike Murphy position on this.
Well, I think that could be the new model because we now, the incentives are not to end because why cut the fun? Trump has made it a reality show. We've trained the electorate that way. And if you're really good at your TV show with constant content and you've got a message that resonates, I don't think the audience is going to want to stop.
Yeah.
Which incentivize the old rule of win early, get free TV, get bundlers and low dollar that works. All that gets blown up. So, and I think the guys who will be good at that are women are not the famous pre-aware Joe Biden titles. It's the Mitch Landrieux. It could be Beto again. It could be, you know, more will come, and there will be a crude arena where they fight it out. But I think the old roll the table thing could be dead.
Yeah.
So can I just build on that for a second and take it to Tad? Because there were people during 2016 who, after Super Tuesday, said it's really mathematically not possible for Senator Sanders to get there. But as long as he's able to raise...
I think I was one of them.
I think you were too. But as long as he's able to keep raising $25 from 1 million people every week, why would he stop? How much of what Mike says is drove 2016, and how much more will it drive 2020, do you think?
Yeah.
And
Well,
anybody
listen,
else?
I think what Mike said makes a lot of sense, you know, and I don't discount it at all. I think the reason it's not going to work that way, and I guess I'm old-fashioned, you know, is because we are so desperate to beat Trump that if you go in Iowa and you come in 10th, let me tell you something. You can have the greatest TV show in the world. People are going to say that guy's a loser. Okay, I gotta go with somebody who's going to win. That's how desperate it is on the Democratic side.
But why aren't they saying that about Beto? He just...
Structure. Lose, come back,
Lose.
decide.
Yeah.
Which means South Carolina.
Sure.
Nira?
Could be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nira,
No, I think Mike makes a good point. I really don't think, I mean, it really just, look, if 20 people are running, right, someone has 20% of the 20% support, those people could stay in. That 20% of the party could stay in for a really long time and essentially, ultimately, just basically wear everybody else out.
So
Let me just make a quick point. One of the things I was hoping we would spend more time on today is how we got the additional 26 million voters in this off-year election from 90 to 116 million. And whether or not the little gesture that you did this morning or on your smartphone, and whether or not people in fact want to be tied in for a longer period with more information, more data, more back and forth, and whether or not that contributes to voter registration, earlier voter registration, greater contributions, whether or not the technical dynamics, I'm probably the least technical person in this room, but whether or not the engagement now is qualitatively different. And that's something that we need to spend more time on as we think about going forward.
good point.
I agree.
Over here in the back, we've got, I'm going to follow the microphone. Okay, sir? Yes.
I heard about lanes. I heard about established candidates that we all know as Democrats already that are going to be competing. What I haven't heard is two things that I'm looking at, which is the outsider, specifically the billionaire, and how is the Democratic Party, who seems to be cracking right now, going to be able to handle Citizens United and all that money that's going to be dumped in from those, you know, so-called billionaires that are waiting and calculating to see if they may be the ones who can buy the lane for the Democratic nomination.
Great question. Dan, you want to start?
So I think that we should not close our eyes to the possibility that something similar could happen to Democrats as happened to Republicans last time, that someone with a lot of resources or an independent media profile could come in and shake things up. I don't think that's going to happen, and I think the parties are not analogous. However, I would say, just to spin a thought scenario for you, like Tom Steyer, I do not think is going to, I don't know if he's going to run for president. I don't think he's going to be the nominee. I don't think he's going to be president. But I think that if you look at the way he has been pushing impeachment and the way the rest of the party leadership has backed away from that because they think it's bad politics, that's an example of an issue which would probably electrify the base but terrify the leadership. And if you think about how Trump took over the Republican Party, one of the big ways was birtherism, which electrified the Republican base and terrified the leadership. And I could imagine a scenario where there's at least a week where if Steyer runs, where he has a moment where he says, why am I the only one on this stage who has the guts to say this president should be impeached when everyone in this audience knows it's true? And that a lot of Democrats will nod their head at that. And what could happen in that week? You know, could there be like a Steyer boomlet, and could he dump a lot of money behind it? It's possible. So I don't think that's, again, I don't think he's going to be the nominee, and I don't even know if he's going to run. But those kinds of scenarios could happen where someone could come along with the right message that finds a part of the market that hasn't been exploited yet, and says something that really gets people talking, and could make an impact that way.
I just briefly say, I think I would actually go in I guess almost the opposite direction of that, which is I don't think impeachment turned out to be that important an issue in the kind of heavily contested primaries, or even in urban centers, it didn't turn out to be such an important issue. I think there's a practicality. I've always said this. I think there's a practicality amongst Democrats that is just very different than Republicans on a whole range of issues. I really think billionaires' message is really an electability argument, which is, I will spend $2 billion to end this national nightmare for you. That is like literally what Michael Bloomberg's best message is. I mean, we had candidates in states win who were pretty not super exciting, but Democrats had been out of power for a long time, and they basically won with I'm the most likely to just win the general. So I think that is actually the best for it. And maybe Tom does that, and maybe Bloomberg does that.
I think a billionaire or two could be, very, potentially successful. But first of all, we just saw in Illinois that someone spent $171 million in one state, a Democratic state, running against a very unpopular Republican governor to win election as governor in that one state. So I don't know if $1 or $2 billion is going to be enough. I mean, I think if you're going to come to the table, you're going to have to really pony up.
Bring your big wallet.
Yeah, you're going to have to. And I believe whether it's the billionaire or the ex-congressman who lost the Senate race but gets hot if he runs, or whoever it is, or Bernie, whoever, the winner of the Democratic nomination in 2020, in my view, is going to be the person who has the most powerful and effective critique of Trump in a future context. Okay, that's who's going to win. You got to figure out what that is. And whoever presents that and sells that, I think, is going to inspire Democrats, and they're going to get behind them.
Yes, sir.
I wonder if the panel could talk about what impact Democratic control of the House in 2019 will have on presidential politics in 2020, either in terms of personalities coming to the fore or issue dynamics.
Mira, you want to take?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I think there's a few ways that the House can really be impactful. One is the power of investigations. I think we should recognize that Democrats will have a rabid conversation for a very long time about the future of the party, and then there will be Donald Trump basically dominating the news. So I think it is really important for Democrats in the House to think through how their investigatory powers make clear that what Trump's administration has really done to people. And I actually think most of the incoming chairs are thinking that way, really unpacking the level of corruption, but also how that corruption has manifested itself in higher student fees, or companies that have really been hit hard by tariffs because one was selected because they're a campaign donor or not. And I think that will be part of it. I think a lot of people in leadership are trying to think through issues in the caucus that do not divide the party, which is not exactly how a presidential campaign is waged. So I think the debate on health care will be much more prescription drugs and strengthening the ACA versus Medicare for all, or some versions of those. I do think also they'll take up political reform, which will be really critical in the presidential debate for believe almost every candidate.
Isn't it interesting we've gone this whole time without talking about Nancy Pelosi also?
Sir, where are the microphones? Oh, there's one over here. And then you're next. Oh.
Thank you very much for an interesting panel. As we say in Hollywood, I'd like to cut to the chase. If the following candidates that I'll mention come to you and ask you to represent them, who would you represent? Beto, Biden, Warren, Bloomberg, Garcetti, even Gary Newsom, Pamela Harris, Landro, which one of those candidates who came to you to represent them would you feel the most comfortable with who could win the election?
So if anybody wants to answer that, they can.
I do not.
If I have to protect the panel from themselves here.
I just want to say, as a genuinely undecided primary voter myself, I want to be convinced by these people. I don't think we should anoint them now and based on how we imagine they'll do. I think we should, campaigns are, what David Axelrod says, what, they're MRIs for the soul. Like, let's see them go through this process and win us over. And I think that it's a crazy, long, expensive process, but it does teach us a lot about the character and the toughness of these candidates, and let's see them go through it.
Are you willing to move to Iowa so you can go to the caucuses?
I've done that. I don't want to do that again.
Let the superdelegates decide.
Hi, great panel. Thanks. Could you guys talk about Kamala Harris and what you see as her strengths? And there was a recent poll, and I don't know who did it, but talking about how every one of the women being discussed, whether it's Harris, Klobuchar, Gillibrand, Oprah, Michelle, they all beat Trump in a head-to-head contest right now. Would a woman be the best choice?
Yeah, I should say, and I think we're a little loath now to talk about how much the victories in 2018 were fueled by women, how much women, my own personal belief is that there is a very large swath of the Democratic Party who did not expect, women in the Democratic Party who did not expect Donald Trump to win, who thought Hillary were going to win, woke up the day after the election and saw a person, credibly accused of sexual assault in the White House by then 13, now 19 women, and they were the women who fueled the Women's March, and they have moved from activism to politics. A lot of them are fueling, as I said, the victories, and I think male and female candidates who won their offices, I would bet 60 to 70% of their volunteers were like mothers 35 to 55. Everywhere I went, I saw mothers. And I think there is something about mothers fueling the resistance to Donald Trump. So I don't know. Women have not always voted en bloc. I would say I think Kamala Harris's powers and strengths, and there are a lot of fantastic women running, and we may have 4 or 5 run. I think she really demonstrated, Kamala demonstrated in the Kavanaugh hearings, she scared, can I swear? She scared the shit out of Brett Kavanaugh. And I think she's a former prosecutor. She's been excellent in hearings. I think she could make a compelling case of how she is the right candidate to take on Donald Trump, because he might just be scared of her in a way that he's not scared of a lot of male candidates. I mean, a big, carnal concern of Democrats that I talk to across the country is having a candidate who is not going to be little Marco'd or low-energy Jeb Bushed. And I think we have to be, and he's gone after a bunch of Democrats already. Some people think effectively. And I think I think everyone, we talk about electability, that is going to be a key component of electability, arguing that you can take a punch and punch back against this guy who may not have every skill to be president, but as a politician has an innate skill to destroy his opponents.
I agree with everything Neera said, but I want to add one thing, which is that I think it's great that we have so many terrific women who look like they're going to run. I also think we are going to discover that a lot of the things that people thought they didn't like about Hillary, or that made Hillary a bad candidate, we're suddenly going to discover that it was, some of that maybe was a little bit individual to her, but a lot of it had to do with gender, and that other women running, it will be different because Hillary went first, and Jen Palmieri, our communications director on the 16 campaigns, talks about going ahead and drawing fire, and I think Hillary did that, and that will help. But we're going to discover there are a lot of factors that the double bind that faces women in public life, they're going to come back with a vengeance, and some that will be even harder than they were for Hillary because Hillary came in with so much experience and national security cred. I think that the next class of women candidates are going to encounter a whole lot of gender bias that we may look back at the Hillary campaign differently after we experience this next one.
I think a lot of people think this is infusing the conversation about Pelosi. I mean, people believe it's infusing the conversation about Pelosi.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of appetite in the electorate, the Democratic side, for women candidates. We saw it. I think of the 37 seats that flipped, 23 of them were women. And by the way, I think a lot of them, not necessarily the women who were anointed beforehand to be the nominees of the party. So I think that's a demonstration of, where that's a lot of seats all across the country for, people just won primaries and then went on to win general elections. So that she could be very well, suited and situated. And again, to have California, when you think of these, when I've done candidates in the past where I had like a home state or something like that, how much time did you guys spend deciding where Minnesota was going to be in 1984 because you wanted to have it there on the calendar? She's got California right there at the beginning, and that's a big deal.
Hi. First, I'd like to thank you all for this fantastic conversation. Since we're talking about candidates now, I'd like to ask, in 2016, we saw the rise of anti-globalist candidates in Trump and Bernie. Trump and Bernie both greatly captured the unions, which were basically traditionally the backbone of the Democratic Party. Do you guys see the Democratic Party moving towards a more democratic socialist / anti-globalist leaning in the future, or do you think it's going to stick to the whole neoliberal thing that kind of Clinton embodied in the 2016 elections?
And if I could just add to that, because I know where you're going. Bernie Sanders seems to be the pace car in the 2020, Bernie and Elizabeth, really, Elizabeth Warren, in the sense that they've set a progressive agenda, and a lot of candidates have moved toward them. You mentioned earlier that he started off all alone on Medicare for all. Now there's 16 senators, and I think 9 people thinking about running for president who are on Medicare for all. Does that continue? Does Bernie set the pace and everybody follows, and then, or do you think there's a different path that Democrats are yearning for?
Well, listen, I think that's going to get settled and sifted out in the nominating process. I don't think it's necessarily going to be an either or. I think these labeled democratic socialists. That whole socialist thing bothered me a lot. And I thought this could be a big liability for Bernie. And I pushed him very, very hard to go and give a speech about what democratic socialism meant. And after many contentious back and forth, he finally agreed to and went to Georgetown and he gave a speech. And as it turned out, if you read that speech or listened to it, as it turns out, his democratic socialism sounds a lot like the unfinished agenda of Franklin Roosevelt, okay, who wanted a second economic Bill of Rights for American workers, okay, and it had nothing to do with the owning the means of production by the government, So I think I think there's a lot of room in the Democratic Party for his ideas and also for ideas that Hillary talked about in policy proposals that people can get together on. And I think once somebody emerges, I think what you're going to see, if someone does emerge, whoever it is, early on in the process, the party is going to move quickly and decisively towards backing them. I really believe that, because they desperately want to take on Trump. And everyone recognizes now that he is the menace that threatens not just the Democratic Party, but America and the world. At least on our side, that's what we believe.
Yeah, I guess I would say, I don't think I'm really disagreeing with Tad, but I guess I would have a different view. I think in 2020, there will be rich debates on issues like, I think there's a uniform view that we should have universal health care, I think we'll have a number of candidates who do not endorse single payer. I think there's a uniform view about, restricting corporate power, how they do that, whether they raise corporate taxes or what means they do. I think will be debated. And I think the thing when you have like 17 candidates running, there will be a wide variety of proposals and policies. I don't think those issues will be the most, I think it actually will be like who can win and put the coalition together. But I do think you'll have a very different kind of debate, and I think we should recognize 2016 was the third term election, right? So for Democrats, like a lot of Democrats didn't really think like Trump was going to win. They thought like sanity is basically American politics. A lot of those people are just really freaked out by what exists today, right? And so I think the interest in electability will take on a lot more salience than particular differences between what form of universal health care plan you support.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we've just got a few minutes left. Does anybody? I'm sorry, you have a microphone. There you go.
So once again, I'd like to echo everyone else, all the questionnaires. Thank you again for this amazing panel. And my question, something that I haven't heard, has been the caravan and what role that played in the 2018 election. Mm-hmm. We had Trump going around the key states, Senate states, mm-hmm. and constantly advocating on behalf mm-hmm. of blocking the caravan and sending military mm-hmm. to the border. what will this issue play in the 2020 election, along with immigration as a whole? We haven't really had someone on the Democratic side call for amnesty, call for open borders, or anything like that. What role would the Latinx vote be in the 2020 election, and then what role would immigration as a whole play in the 2020 election?
Do you want to talk? I'm
Sure.
happy to talk about it.
I think the result, I mean, I'll be like, as everyone, as people know, I'm pretty candid. I think the issue with I think what Trump was really trying to do was electrify his base, right? In a midterm, it's hard to get. In a midterm, they skew more college-educated than non-college. And I think we should recognize he was pretty effective in states like Indiana, North Dakota, and Missouri in getting a lot of people out in rural communities. One thing we should be all aware of, that in Alabama, in Connor Lamb's district, in Alabama, and even in Danny O'Connor's district, those elections were really close because a lot of white conservative rural voters really hit 50%, whereas Democrats were hitting 75, 80%. But it was much more evenly matched. Now, I think his attacks on the caravan actually also energized suburban women and a lot of suburban men. And I think the kind of, I'll say, disgusting behavior post the synagogue to continue to talk about the caravan probably moves some races. My own view is Donald Trump is not a person who seems to change tricks like all that much, and may well just be xenophobic all the way to the next 2 years, thinking that Arizona is not likely to be an issue and he needs the Midwest and West. I think Democrats have to recognize that. And one challenge we have in the Democratic Party, or I should say they have in the Democratic Party, is Donald Trump has an innate ability to define his opponents. So you were right. There is no actual Democrat that I'm aware of that believes in open borders, right? But I'd say 40% of Americans today believe Democrats are for open borders because Donald Trump says it every day. And some of them don't care that much about, but some of them care a lot. And I think this is going to be an issue people have to wrestle with in the primary and say, how do we address that? Because that is a challenge.
The other thing I think that Trump's focus on the caravan revealed was that in the perennial debate we've had since the end of 2016 about whether Trump's appeal was primarily an economic anxiety message or fundamentally, like, to euphemize it, cultural anxiety. We know where Trump stands on that debate. I mean, when he had he was not barnstorming the country selling his tariffs. It wasn't his anti-globalist agenda. It was be scared of immigrants. That's what he thinks is the way to energize his people. He may well be right about that, but we should at least, understand that, like, he knows his voters pretty well, and that's what he thinks motivates them. So he'll keep doing it.
Okay, we have time for one more if we have one more. Steve?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Wait for the microphone.
Hi. Thank you all so much. Curious question. Do you find other Democrats, I'm looking at myself, who are angry at the entirety of the Democratic leadership and the political class for bringing us the Trump presidency and the state we're now in? Is that a factor?
Yes.
Is that just one of me?
I do,
Or are
yes.
there a lot of Democrats and independents who think that? 'Cause I've been a Democratic activist my whole life, and I'm angry at the whole bunch.
You're angry at the result, or you're angry at what was there?
I hold the political class and the incumbent Democrats in Congress and throughout the states responsible for us having the Trump presidency, and the rest. We all have fear and loathing of the Trump regime, but I'm saying and I know some friends of mine, including quietly other activists, have the same feeling of great anger, fear and loathing of the Republicans and Trump, but great anger at the Democratic political class and the Democratic establishment for bringing us to the moment we're now at.
And why do you blame them versus Republicans? Why do you blame?
My dislike is greater for the Republicans.
No, but why? So some candidates were fighting Trump, right? So I'm just asking you.
For example,
why do you,
the insistence by so much of the smart people in my party, and I was a member of the DNC for 8 years, so much with the insistence of the smart people in my party that Hillary Clinton had to be the nominee when she so clearly had so many challenges for the voters.
And yet, we had a very contested primary that went through every state in the country, and millions more actual Democrats wanted her as the nominee, and then millions more actual American voters wanted her as president. So there's a lot of things we should have done differently, a lot of blame to go around, but most of the blame is with Donald Trump and anyone who voted for him. And I think that we should probably remember that.
With that, we're going to end it. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, panel. Thank you all for coming.
There's coffee and cookies outside. We'll reconvene in 15 minutes to answer the question, what's next for the GOP? I will not be answering that.